When Richard Walker found out that his success was built on his father's shady dealings, his world collapsed. He was faced with a choice: keep his fortune or expose the crimes and sacrifice everything. What he did next shocked even the most hardened. But let's start from the beginning. Richard Walker sat at his massive desk, made of polished mahogany, in his corner office on the top floor of one of the city's most prestigious skyscrapers. The office was bathed in light pouring through panoramic windows, offering a view of the sprawling metropolis below, with its noisy streets, cars, and endless streams of people. This was a symbol of his success, his perseverance, his long climb to the top, during which he never looked back. But in his hands was a very different symbol. It was an old photograph, slightly faded and worn around the edges, as if it had been handled many times and kept in a special place. The photograph depicted his childhood home, a small but cozy house on the outskirts of a provincial town. Richard gazed at the picture and for a moment was lost in memories of the days when that house was the center of his world. The house stood on a quiet street, far from the city's hustle and bustle. It always looked well kept: white shutters on the windows, bright flowers lining the path to the door, and a small front yard where his mother loved tending her garden. So many years had passed since then. He had left that place to start a new life, build a career, and create his fortune. But despite the time that had passed, that house still lived in his memory. The warm glow from its windows at night, the smell of freshly baked pies, the laughter in the living room. It all seemed both distant and close at the same time. His mother had sold the house when Richard was 18. His father had died, and the family's financial situation had quickly deteriorated. It was a tough time for Richard, and he swore back then that he would do everything to secure a better life for himself and his mother. From that day on, he never looked back, immersing himself in work and business, putting all his efforts into building his future. But now, holding this old photo, Richard felt a wave of nostalgia rising within him. He was surprised at how much this small image could affect him. His entire life had been built on clear decisions and cold calculations. He was used to everything around him being governed by strict rules of success and business. Yet now, for the first time in a long time, something entirely different stirred within him. A longing for the past, for memories. It felt as though this place was calling him back, urging him to return to his roots, to where it all began. Recently, his secretary had come across a property listing by chance. She found it interesting that the house where Richard had spent his childhood was back on the market. She showed him the document, not expecting it to provoke such a reaction. At first, Richard brushed off the news, deeming it unimportant. After all, he had so many meetings, projects, and deals to attend to. But later, when he was alone in his office, he picked up the photo and thought, what if he returned to the place where it all began? The thought seemed odd at first. After all, he had left that life behind, and living in the big city was worlds apart from the one he once knew. Yet the longer he looked at the photograph, the stronger the desire to return became. Why not? Why not see what had become of that house, of that place? Something inside him begged to return, as if there were unresolved matters waiting for him. Without much hesitation, he asked his personal assistant to arrange a trip to that town. He had no intention of revealing his true motives to anyone. It would seem too sentimental for someone of his status. But within himself, Richard knew he needed this journey. He hoped the trip would help him deal with something he had long pushed into the far corners of his memory. The next day, he boarded a private jet heading for the small provincial town he had left so many years ago. He spent the entire flight in silence, trying to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the house he was about to see again. He recalled how he used to spend summer evenings with his mother and father on the porch, how he would do his homework in the small bedroom upstairs after school. The memories flooded back, mixed with the bitterness of losing his father and his mother's struggle to survive after his death. The plane landed at a small airfield, where a rented car was waiting for him. Richard was accustomed to comfort and personal drivers, but this time he decided to drive himself. He wanted full control over his journey. The weather was clear, and the sunlight gently illuminated the road leading to the edge of town. The closer he got, the more his anxiety grew. Richard wondered what the house would look like now, after all these years. Would anything remain of the fond memories he had held on to? As he turned onto the familiar street, his heart began to race. The house that had meant so much to him appeared before his eyes once more. However, its current condition sparked mixed emotions. The house looked abandoned. The walls were peeling, the shutters crooked, and the garden overgrown with weeds. The lawn where his mother's flowers once bloomed was now covered in wild grass, and the fence was in dire need of repair. But despite the neglect, the house still felt familiar, still felt like home. Even in its state of disrepair, it reminded him of better days. Richard stepped out of the car and slowly approached the house. He stopped at the doorstep, and images from his childhood filled his mind. There was his mother calling him in to help with dinner. There was his father teaching him how to fix a bike. These memories stirred unexpected emotions in him, feelings he hadn't experienced in years. This house wasn't just a place, it was a part of him, a part of his soul. Standing at the entrance, Richard felt a strange sense of unease. He hadn't been prepared for the emotions he was experiencing now. He had come here as a businessman, to consider a potential deal. But now he realized that this place meant much more to him. It was his home, the place where his life began, and this return had awakened something within him that he could no longer ignore. Richard knew that this journey would change him. When Richard Walker stepped over the threshold of his childhood home, for a moment, it felt as if he had returned to the past. The creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet, the dust covering every surface, and the oppressive silence seemed almost ominous, as if the house itself was trying to hide something important from him. Despite the house's terrible state, sections of the ceiling had collapsed, windows were shattered, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Echoes of the life that once thrived here were still visible in every corner. Each room held memories of another time. Richard wandered through the house, trying not to dwell too much on how long it had been since he last set foot inside these walls. In one room, he saw the old piano his mother used to play in the evenings, when life seemed carefree and full of light. In another room, the former living room, dusty chairs still stood, as if someone had only recently left them, with half-read books resting on the armrests. Richard touched one of the chairs, and a scene from his childhood flashed before his eyes, sitting with his father, watching TV, while his mother made tea in the kitchen. It all seemed so distant, almost unreal. He continued, step by step, delving deeper into the past, which seemed to be calling out to him. At some point, Richard stopped in front of the door to his father's study. This room had always been special to him, a place he had entered cautiously as a child. His father spent many hours here, lost in his thoughts and papers, often leaving the family in the background. Richard had never been allowed to enter without permission, and even after his father's death, he rarely dared to enter the room. But now, he felt a strange urge to open the door and step inside. He pushed the door open, and it creaked as it allowed him entry. The study was full of dust and abandonment, but oddly, everything was still in its place. The desk, the old leather chair, the shelves filled with books his father used to read so diligently. Richard ran his hand across the desk, leaving a thin line among the dust. He approached the bookshelf, where the books were neatly arranged, but one old book caught his attention. It looked different from the others. The book was worn, with torn edges, as if it had been frequently taken down and leafed through. Upon closer inspection, he noticed that the book stuck out slightly from the others, as if someone had left it partly open. Curiosity got the better of him, and Richard pulled the book out to take a closer look. As he removed it from the shelf, a small hidden compartment was revealed behind it. Richard frowned, surprised that he had never noticed this secret spot before, despite having been in the study many times as a child. Inside the compartment, under the old book, lay another item, a thin, battered, leather-bound journal. He picked it up, his heart beginning to race. It was his mother's journal. Richard had always known his mother to be a reserved person, a woman who rarely shared her emotions. She had always seemed strong, unshakable. Even during the most difficult times, when the family was on the brink of financial ruin after his father's death, she had never shown any sign of weakness. But now, holding her journal in his hands, Richard felt as though he was holding the key to a part of her life he had never known. He sat down at the desk and began carefully turning the pages. At first, the entries were filled with memories of his childhood, descriptions of his mother's daily routines, her care for the home, and her concerns for her son. But the further he read, the heavier the entries became. Gradually, the journal revealed truths that his mother had apparently hidden for years. She wrote about how difficult life had been after his father's death, how much hardship she had endured trying to keep the family afloat. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In the pages of the journal, his mother began to speak about his father, the man Richard had always idolized, the one he believed had brought the family to success and given them a chance at a better life. However, the truth was much darker. It turned out that his father had been involved in criminal activities, of which Richard had been completely unaware. The journal described deals that had never been spoken of in the family, secret arrangements, and illegal financial operations that had helped lift the family out of poverty. His father had hidden this from everyone, including his mother, until the truth began to seep through. Richard read about how his mother gradually discovered the truth and how it shattered her trust in her husband. She described how one day his father disappeared, leaving the family behind. It turned out he hadn't left because of illness or work, but to protect them from the criminal world he had been dragged into, which could have destroyed them all. Richard's mother wrote that she had lived with this knowledge for the rest of her life, hiding it from her son so as not to ruin his perception of the family. She hadn't wanted young Richard to know what kind of man his father really was. These revelations shook Richard to his core. He sat there staring at the journal, struggling to process everything. His memories of childhood, of his father, everything he had believed to be true, had suddenly been turned upside down. He had thought his father was a model of hard work and honesty, someone who had lifted the family from poverty, someone Richard had always looked up to. But now, knowing the truth, Richard realized that his success was built not just on perseverance and integrity, but on the shadow of the crimes his family had hidden. He realized that his father, the man he had respected and loved for so long, had been involved in things Richard couldn't have imagined. This was not the perfect image of a father he had carried in his mind all these years. Richard had always believed that his success was the result of hard work and dedication, but now he couldn't shake the thought that his wealth was the product of his family's dark dealings. Reading the journal left him with a sense of emptiness and pain. He felt betrayed not only by his father, but also by his mother, who had kept the truth from him. But more than anything, he was haunted by the thought that many people may have suffered because of his family's actions. People whose lives may have been destroyed by the very deals that had allowed his father to achieve success. And now, with the truth in front of him, Richard knew he couldn't continue living as though he didn't know. The shock Richard experienced upon learning the truth about his father left him paralyzed. A sense of emptiness gripped him, as if his life had suddenly lost all meaning. He could no longer trust his memories or his belief in family, because what he had thought was the foundation of his success now appeared in a completely different light. Sitting in silence, in the dimness of his office, he tried to cope with the sudden collapse of his familiar world. The diary of his mother, which he had found in the old house, was like a shadow from the past, turning his entire existence upside down. His idealization of his father, the certainty that the family's success had been achieved through honest labor, was nothing more than an illusion. A storm of questions raged inside him. How could this have happened? How had he not seen it before? He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt rising from deep within. His wealth, his career, his power now seemed dirty and tainted. Everything he had achieved, everything that had once seemed like a great triumph, now looked like a pathetic facade built on lies. He realized that the people he had left behind in the past, his partners, employees, even his clients, could all have been victims of the very system his father had been a part of, and by extension, so had he, unknowingly. His father's shadow loomed ever larger, casting itself over his business and his entire life. Richard felt like a puppet in the hands of fate, a marionette whose strings had been pulled long before he began to move. Instead of ignoring the truth, Richard made a firm decision. He needed to uncover everything. The thought had planted itself in his mind that his success had not been built on honest dealings, but on lies and manipulation. He could no longer live in ignorance. As a businessman, he was used to dissecting the intricacies of every deal, analyzing every detail, and now his life required the same level of scrutiny. He hired a private investigator to help him uncover the full truth, leaving no detail untouched. The detective began his work, sifting through documents and contracts, delving into the archives of companies Richard's father had once dealt with. This process took several weeks, but each new revelation brought more disturbing facts. Richard was horrified to discover that many of the companies he still worked with were deeply entangled in the same criminal schemes his father had once orchestrated. Worse, these companies continued to exist and thrive, covering their illegal operations with legitimate deals, money laundering, and tax evasion. They used Richard's funds and his investments to hide their crimes, while presenting themselves as successful and reputable firms. Each new piece of information from the detective felt like a hammer blow to his head. Richard realized that his success was partially dependent on the very dark dealings of which he had been unaware. How could he have been so blind? He felt betrayed not only by his father, but also by himself. Because his success, his power, which he had been so proud of, were built on a foundation of corruption. It was as if everything he valued had been betrayed. Now, every time he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a successful man. He saw the son of a man who had led a double life and left behind a terrible legacy. Every day, as he walked into his office, Richard felt increasing pressure. His usual meetings, project discussions, and business deals were overshadowed by a persistent thought. What if this company is also involved in criminal activity? Every deal seemed suspicious. Every partner seemed to be part of the dark network he had never even known existed. This thought consumed him. He looked at his assets, his capital, and realized that perhaps all of it was built on the lives of people who had been victimized by the criminal schemes hidden behind the respectable facades. One company in particular tormented him, the one he had been working with for many years. It was one of his key partner companies, providing a steady flow of capital. This company had been a major source of revenue for his business, and for years Richard had considered it a model of success. However, the detective revealed that behind the facade of legal operations lay a criminal empire engaged in money laundering and shadowy dealings. The funds Richard had invested in this company were being used to conceal its true nature, and without knowing it, he had been supporting its continued existence. These discoveries turned Richard's life into a living nightmare. He realized he was faced with a choice that would not only affect his career, but also his moral integrity. Either he would expose this company and sever all ties with it, or he would continue to work with them, turning a blind eye to their dark affairs, just as his father had done. But the choice was far more complex than he had imagined. Exposing the company would not only mean severing ties, but also the collapse of his business. This company provided a significant portion of his income, and without it, his entire financial empire could crumble. To expose them would mean putting everything he had built over the years at risk. The moral aspect of the decision was even more difficult. If he decided to continue working with the company, he would effectively become part of the same system his father had created. He would have to close his eyes to the crimes, the suffering of people who might have been affected by these deals. He would become just like his father, and in doing so, destroy his own self-image as an honest and just man. These thoughts haunted him day and night. He couldn't sleep, constantly returning to the same dilemma. Richard understood that no matter what he chose, this decision would change his life forever. Either he would sacrifice everything for the sake of truth and justice, or he would keep his empire intact, but lose his soul. He knew that if he made the wrong decision now, he would never again be able to look in the mirror with the same respect for himself. Richard hesitated for a long time before making his final decision. The moral dilemma that had been tearing him apart from within finally reached its breaking point. He knew that exposing the company involved in shady dealings, which had used his funds to cover its criminal operations, could destroy not only his business, but also the reputation he had spent years building. Yet, Every time he returned to that thought, a sense of heaviness overwhelmed him. The weight of secrets and lies he had been carrying ever since he discovered his mother's diary. Deep down, he realized that this could not continue. He could no longer live, turning a blind eye to the fact that his success was built on dirty money and crime. The path to this decision had been long and arduous. Richard spent hours reflecting, consulting with lawyers, trying to find even the slightest way to minimize the damage to his empire. But every plan, every suggestion put forward implied a compromise with the truth. These were clever schemes to keep the business intact and avoid scandal, but they required Richard to continue supporting the very people who were engaged in illegal activities. To follow that path would mean becoming just like his father, a man willing to sacrifice moral principles for wealth and power. He often stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city, which now appeared entirely different to him. Previously, every skyscraper, every street, every detail of the cityscape had been symbols of success, power, and his achievements, but now they reminded him of the dirt lurking beneath the surface, the shadow that hung over him. Richard realized that his empire, like this city, was nothing but a beautiful illusion, hiding dark secrets. Finally, one evening, he made his final decision. He could no longer live with this lie. Gathering all the documents he had, along with the materials his private investigator had collected, Richard went to the prosecutor's office. This was his moment of truth. He handed over all the evidence, contracts, bank statements, and documents proving that his key partners had been playing a double game, engaged in criminal activity. Richard understood that this action would have enormous consequences, but at that moment, there was no turning back. This act marked the beginning of the end for his empire. As soon as the information became public, a massive scandal erupted. The media quickly picked up the story, turning it into front-page news. Richard Walker's name, once associated with success and prosperity, now appeared in the headlines linked to financial crime investigations. Each day brought new details, new revelations. The reputation of his company plummeted rapidly. Partners who had once considered Richard their most reliable ally began distancing themselves from him, fearing being dragged into the scandal. Contracts were terminated one after another, investors withdrew their funds, and Richard's business empire began to collapse like a house of cards. Within weeks, he was hit with a barrage of lawsuits. People he had once worked with filed suits against him, trying to salvage their assets and minimize their own losses. His lawyers were inundated with papers and court summonses. Richard was forced to sell his companies one by one to pay off debts and settle legal claims. Many of his assets were frozen, and his accounts were seized. Each day brought new blows. Those who had once lined up to do business with him now wanted nothing to do with him. His friends, colleagues, and partners disappeared one by one. Only a small circle of lawyers and advisors remained, trying to minimize the damage. In the end, he lost almost everything. From what had once been a thriving business empire, only ruins remained. Yet, despite all of this, Richard felt an inner relief for the first time in years. Although his world was crumbling around him, he knew he had done the right thing. For the first time in years, he could look at himself in the mirror without shame or guilt. He knew he had exposed the truth, cleared his name from the shadow of his father, and broken the chain of crimes that stretched from the past. This decision was, for him, an act of liberation. Now that his past had been laid bare, he could begin a new life, free from deceit and lies. Realizing that his path as a businessman had come to an end, Richard decided to completely change his life. Whatever remained of his fortune, he directed towards charity. His wealth, which once seemed like a curse, now became a means of atoning for past mistakes. He no longer wanted to be part of the world of big money and influence, a world so intertwined with crime and corruption. Instead, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to helping those who truly needed it. This was his redemption, his attempt to correct the wrongs committed by his family and himself. One of his first steps was to reclaim his childhood home, the same house where he had found his mother's diary and where his journey toward the truth had begun. But now, this house would serve a different purpose. It would no longer be a symbol of pain and loss. He decided to transform it into a shelter for families in need, families who found themselves in difficult circumstances. He wanted this place, once filled with secrets and hidden tragedies, to become a source of light and hope for those who had lost their homes and families. Richard invested all his remaining funds into renovating the house. He restored it to the state it had been in during his childhood, and added modern amenities to make it comfortable and safe for the people who would live there. He worked with local charities to help families in crisis find temporary housing and support. For Richard, this project became his main purpose, the new meaning of his life. He often visited the house, watching as families moved in, as the house once again filled with the laughter of children, as it became full of life. Each time he heard the voices of children, he remembered his own childhood and felt that he had made the right choice. This house, which had once symbolized his family's past, had now become the symbol of a new chapter in his life, a life filled with honesty, justice, and a desire to help others. In this way, Richard found his new purpose. He was no longer the cold and calculating businessman he had once been. Now, he was a man who sought to atone for the mistakes of his family and his own life by helping those in need.